I'm Mr. Robinson, and this is our very first interactive lesson. In fact, it's only the second one I've ever made. I made one for criminal law today, too. In this lesson, I'm going to lead you through some of the things we might talk about in a class based on what you told me you'd like to learn more about. While we do this, there's a few things you might like to have handy. They are your readings from your textbook. That's what this is based on. Your homework, the one where you read in the textbook and wrote about democracy, as well as your notes. Remember that during this interactive lesson, you'll be writing things down and showing them to me for a grade. So, we've already talked about democracy, and I gave you a definition that it's a system of government where the people have power, directly or indirectly, to influence policy. That is, to affect what government does. Remember that for our definitions, and this is a key one, it's less important that you memorize the exact wording, and more important that you know what each element means and can phrase it yourself in the way that works for you. We talked about how direct democracies exist, but are pretty rare. And a little later, we'll look at some elements of direct democracy that are present in America today. But one thing that's true is that most countries that are democracies, including the United States, are indirect democracies, where we choose leaders who decide on policy for us. There is democracy involved because our votes choose the leaders, but it's not direct because we're not choosing to vote on every law. In fact, we don't have that power. Let's look at each branch and how each branch shows indirect democracy at work. I'd recommend writing down all the details of the three branches that I share out loud today, because that'll help make the framework for what we talk about for the rest of the year and next week in particular. All right, our legislative branch is Congress. Congress is made up of two parts, the House and the Senate. And together, they make laws. They don't make laws with our input, but they are chosen by us. The people vote on members of the House. Every state's divided into districts, or some of the tiny states just get one House member. And every state has two senators that are elected statewide. That's a democratic vote for a leader who then makes their own decisions. Write in your notes one thing you know Congress can do other than make laws. And if you're not sure, write down a guess. Remember that at any point you can pause this video, you can rewind to look at stuff that you didn't quite get, and you can make it go faster, which is kind of fun if there's a part you're feeling pretty familiar with. Don't skip anything by entirely, but feel free to speed me up. I want you to know, because we'll talk more about this later, that the U.S. Senate wasn't always chosen by the people. In fact, it used to be chosen by state legislatures, the lawmakers in the states. The Constitution's 17th Amendment changed that, but before that, people chose state lawmakers. The state lawmakers chose U.S. senators. It was still indirect democracy. It was just even more indirect. The executive branch is the same way. Pretty darn indirect. People choose our state legislators. Those state legislators decide, by making laws, exactly how the electoral college members from their state are chosen. And those electors choose the president and vice president. That's an indirect method, but it's democratic nonetheless, because it's our leaders that we elected who pick the method for deciding where our state's electoral votes go. These days, every single state bases its electoral votes on the will of the people as well. They look at how the people voted for president and vice president. It wasn't always that way. South Carolina totally ignored the popular vote until the 1860s. It was still indirect democracy because people chose state lawmakers who chose electors, but they totally ignored the votes of the people for president. One thing the president can do is act as commander-in-chief, send troops out to fight. Name one other thing the president can do in your notes so you'll be ready for class discussion. Let's look at the judicial branch now. So we said people choose the president pretty indirectly. It's the president who nominates judges, and the U.S. Senate who confirms them. That is, they vote yes or no on the president's choices to be judge. One thing that judges can do, without our input, again, because it's an indirect democracy, one thing judges can do is interpret the law. They decide what the law means. If the law says hats are illegal, you cannot wear a hat, they've got to decide what a hat means. Name one other thing judges can do, or that you think they might do, in your notes, because that'll make for good conversation in class. We just looked at the three branches, how each of them is a sign of the U.S. and its nature as an indirect democracy. It's worth thinking about that these elections generally mean the person who has power had the preference, had the support of a majority of those voting. Not always. A majority is over half. And if several people are running, it could just be the biggest piece of the pie and not over half of Americans. But either way, the preferences of the majority win far more often than anything else. With majority rule, though, political scientists say, scholars who study democracy and what they think it should be, with majority rule comes an obligation to respect minority rights. Otherwise, you're not being a good democracy at all. I'm on board with that. Write down anything this image makes you think of, or related thoughts about how the balance between majority rule and minority rights has played out in America. We haven't always done a good job, and that's worth looking at. We will. As we look at other elements of democratic theory, we'll use the thoughts of Robert Dahl, not Roald Dahl, who wrote James and the Giant Peach, but Robert Dahl, the political scientist. He's got 5 elements of traditional democratic theory that you read about and wrote about for homework. Think about the one you evaluated. And now in your notes, I'll try to get you to write down thoughts, examples, and questions about the other elements as well. I want us to be able to evaluate our country, and this is one way to do it. The first element we'll look at is enlightened understanding. One way to think about that is, in order to truly have impact on government's policy choices, the people can't just have the right to vote. They should have the right to understand what's going on, to make an informed choice when they vote. And for that to happen, we need freely competing ideas out there. We need truth out there as well. Evaluate in your notes. How well are we doing at giving our citizens the understanding they need to make their vote truly effective? Write down anything this inspires, from present-day America to the past. Remember, you can pause while you write. The next element of democracy we'll look at is inclusion. A true democracy, if it says the people have power, needs to include all of the people. What does that mean? Most democracies, in fact, no democracies, allow babies to vote. So there are some cutoffs in terms of age, and there may be other cutoffs as well. But are we cutting out too many citizens from full citizenship, from the full rights of being part of a democracy? You see this picture of suffragettes. Write down some other examples you can think of, people who were denied the right to vote, either present day or in the past. It's worth examining. Overall, our democracy's grown more inclusive. And here's a lucky link, constitutional amendments. So there's 27 in total, and a lot of them have been aimed at expanding the inclusiveness of our democracy. Not all of them have been promises we lived up to right away, but many of them have said we want to expand the right to vote. We talked about the 17th Amendment that says now U.S. citizens can vote for their senators rather than relying on the votes of their state legislators. Let's look at 3 others. The 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments. Make sure you know how they increased the inclusion of our democracy. The 15th, which said the right to vote cannot be denied on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That is, if you were enslaved, you cannot be denied the right to vote because of that. This is after the Civil War. The 19th Amendment, which says the right to vote cannot be restricted on account of sex, meant that women who were denied the right to vote in most states now were guaranteed that right. Some states did it early on. New Jersey briefly let women vote in the 1700s. In fact, it also opened it up regardless of race and then took that back. Wyoming was the first state to allow women to vote and never take it away. The 26th Amendment, which we brought up in some of our classes, allowed, in fact, guaranteed 18-year-olds the right to vote. It said the right to vote cannot be abridged on account of age for anyone 18 or over. So states could go lower. And some, like Maryland, have let local elections be open to those starting at age 16. States could choose to go lower. There's nothing to prevent them from doing that, but they cannot make a higher age for voting now. Write down in your notes one reason you think that might be that the 26th Amendment, which was ratified, I believe, in 1971, might have gotten passed. inclusiveness. These three amendments are good to know. We'll also look at citizen control of the agenda. So in order for democracy to truly be effective, we can't just let the citizens vote for their leaders. We've got to let them vote for their leaders and have an impact on what gets passed. Anyone know what these pictures are of? They're yes and no posters on an issue that the people got to vote directly on in California back in 2008. The people in many states have the right to vote yes or no on certain issues that come up before them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. This was about whether or not gay marriage should be legalized, something that's guaranteed as a right in every state today because of a Supreme Court decision, but that many states battled before that 2015 Supreme Court decision. We'll talk about three things that relate to citizen control of the agenda, three ways in which some states have given citizens more control. The initiative process that some states have, Virginia does not, allows citizens to put a question on the ballot in the next election if they get enough signatures on a petition. That is, if they gather enough signatures, then there will be a yes or no question on the ballot that says, should we legalize marijuana? Should we raise taxes? Should we ban the death penalty? It's worth thinking about that in many states that have adopted the initiative process, the most successful initiatives are often ones with big corporate money behind them, because then there's funding to hire people to go around and gather signatures. Even a mode of increasing democracy could still give more power to those who have it already. Referendum is similar. That's a general term for a yes or no vote, but many states have referenda, that's the plural, on matters that were not proposed by the people, that were not initiatives. Virginia allows referenda on state constitutional amendments. And in fact, in most elections, there's some amendment to the state constitution up for a vote. Unlike the national constitution, which has only changed 27 times, state constitutions often change frequently. They're easier to change a lot of times. In Virginia, they've got to be approved by the state legislature twice, 2 years in a row, and then they go up for a vote before the people. So stay tuned, look at your own ballot, and you might see a state constitutional amendment up for your vote. A referendum is a yes or no vote, but doesn't have to be based on a citizen's petition the way an initiative does. The last is recall. A recall vote is one in which citizens can vote on whether they want to kick out a political figure before their term is up. One of the most famous ones was in California near the beginning of the century. They had a governor named Gray Davis. Enough people signed a petition to put a yes or no question on the ballot. Do we kick out Gray Davis early, before his term is up? So that November, they voted yes to kick him out. His term wouldn't be up for another couple of years. And at the same time, since the voters of California knew they had a chance of kicking out their current governor, there was a list of everyone else running. There were hundreds of people on that list. Actually, specifically, I think there were about 100. That's a long list. It's different than a normal election. People who said they wanted to be governor if Gray Davis got kicked out. So the other question on the ballot for Californians that year was, if our governor is kicked out, who do you want to replace him? Who won? Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was an actor in the movie Total Recall, got the job of governor of California because of a recall. Because a governor got kicked out early, Arnold became governor. There were a lot of people on that ballot, including adult film stars, child actor Gary Coleman, quite a few people. Someone well into her 90s ran, but Arnold won. Those are all ways citizens can control the agenda directly, but often we're looking at whether the United States allows citizens to control it indirectly. Do they get listened to when they speak to the lawmakers in charge? Effective participation asks if there's real opportunities for us to influence decision-making. Not just do we control the agenda, but how often do we get a chance to make our vote? In Virginia, every year, there's some kind of election in November. We're going to look at the offices that are up for a vote. And I want you to write down in your notes now some offices you know that you can vote for as a resident of Virginia, at least if you are a citizen and you're 18. What jobs, what offices can you vote for? Name as many as you can. We'll use those in conversation. The last element we'll look at is equality in voting. Do all votes count the same? What I showed you here was an example of how they don't in the United States. Every state has electors, but even the tiniest states still get 3 electors for president. So that means Wyoming, which has around 500,000 residents, still gets 3 electoral votes. California, which has millions and millions more, over 30 million residents, gets more electoral votes. But per person, your vote counts more in Wyoming, because even the tiniest states still get 3 electoral votes. If a bomb went off and everyone in Wyoming but a couple of people died, they'd still get 3 electoral votes. And this particular graphic, which is older, so the exact numbers are outdated, shows how many people per electoral vote there are in a couple of different states. Wyoming, just a few people, a mere 142,000 per electoral vote. New York, it takes over 500,000 to get that 1 electoral vote. So there's some differences from state to state. Here's a sneak preview of a case we'll look at later on, Baker v. Carr. Even though there haven't been successful constitutional challenges to the Electoral College, which has some inequality to it, there have been successful challenges to the way states used to draw their lines for state legislature. Some states, for example, never changed their lines as urban population grew, and particularly a growing number of Black residents scared the people in power. A lot of states said, we're going to keep our lines the same. We're going to keep one district for this huge city and another district for this sparsely populated, mostly white rural area. I know that means there's way more people that only get to vote for one lawmaker in the city, and very few people who still get to vote for one lawmaker in the country. But we want to do that. And it wasn't until the case Baker v. Carr that the Supreme Court said, you know what? Courts might get to overturn that. It's a fair question of whether that violates the Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution that says to treat citizens equally. Before that, courts said, that's a political issue we don't want to get involved in. After this case, there started to be challenges that were successful, overturning some of these state practices, many of them driven by racism, that promoted inequality in their state districting. We'll look at that case this year because it's one of the 15 that are closely studied on the AP government exam. All right, we're moving on to a new topic, models of democracy. You read about 3, and I'm going to introduce a 4th that the AP exam loves to talk about. So elite and class theory is probably the most straightforward. These 2 gents here represent an elite, probably a wealthy elite. And one theory for how our democracy works is that the wealthy have all the power. Write down in your notes one example that you think illustrates how just a few people, perhaps the wealthy, perhaps another specialized elite group, exercise most of the power in this country. Try it out. You might have written about it for homework. Although these are theories of how democracy works, a couple of them are actually models for how democracy should work as well. That is, we'll look at all 4 as just descriptions of how America might be working now, but the 2 optimistic ones can also be seen as models for how people think democracies should work. Pluralism is one of those. It's the happy ending theory. It says, actually, it's not just a few elites who have power. A lot of different groups have power. They all try to influence government. There's many voices getting heard, and as a result, we reach a sort of balance. Key words to think about for pluralism is competition produces compromise. It's an optimistic view of America, and I want you to write in your notes some examples of where you think we might fall in a sort of balanced place on some issues, where neither side is exactly happy, but both sides have had input into the policy we use today in the US. Where has competition resulted in compromise? Hyperpluralism, as this traffic jam might illustrate, says, yeah, a lot of groups get heard, but it's kind of terrible. Key things to think about. Hyperpluralism says strong groups lead to a weak government and that's bad. That in fact, as a result of those strong groups influencing government, we either get gridlock, which is another term for this traffic jam, everything locks up and nothing gets done. Or we get instability going back and forth as soon as a new group has power. So policy that is unstable. Think about this. See if you can think of an example where either nothing's getting done because competition makes things freeze up, or where you see policy going back and forth because different groups take power and influence government. The fourth one, the one that's not in your book but is worth talking about, is participatory democracy. This is a theory of democracy that says it's not really about groups as much as individuals who are deeply engaged. It's also a hopeful and aspirational model for how democracy should be. The theory of participatory democracy says informed, engaged people acting locally, sometimes not part of groups, can make a difference and are really part of what makes our democracy thrive. And there's examples of that, where you might see local group action even outside of government influencing the way things work. Write down in your notes an example of where you think that's actually an accurate theory of how power works in America. Keywords: individuals who are engaged. So we've looked at 4 models, like these 4 mannequins here. And I want you to be thinking throughout this class really about how each of them might have elements of truth. If you haven't already, put in your notes some examples of how things work today that show the truth of one or more of these models, and examples of particular policies, gun control, the environment, abortion, healthcare, where you think what's going on with that policy helps illustrate the truth of one of these models of government. The next thing to talk about, and you get a video from 2 different presidents, is the scope of government. You read about that idea of how much should government do, and it's a big question for us to look at all year long. I'm going to play this 1.5-minute long video of Ronald Reagan.
Ours was the first revolution in the history of mankind that truly reversed the course of government, and with 3 little words: we the people. We the people tell the government what to do. It doesn't tell us. We the people are the driver. The government is the car. And we decide where it should go and by what route and how fast. Almost all the world's constitutions are documents in which governments tell the people what their privileges are. Our Constitution is a document in which we the people tell the government what it is allowed to do. We the people are free. This belief has been the underlying basis for everything I've tried to do these past 8 years. But back in the 1960s, when I began, it seemed to me that we'd begun reversing the order of things. That through more and more rules and regulations and confiscatory taxes, the government was taking more of our money, more of our options, and more of our freedom. I went into politics in part to put up my hand and say, stop. I was a citizen politician, and it seemed the right thing for a citizen to do. I think we have stopped a lot of what needed stopping, and I hope we have once again reminded people that man is not free unless government is limited. There's a clear cause and effect here that is as neat and predictable as a law of physics. As government expands, liberty contracts.
So Ronald Reagan laid out here a theory of how government should be limited. And that idea as a broad principle is something that he has in common with political scientists who believe that there must be limited government. Ronald Reagan goes further than that, though. His philosophy is that government should be limited as much as possible. The more, the better. As government expands, he says, liberty contracts. Once he joked that the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. The message he was laying out is that government is not a helpful force most of the time. That is what we call a conservative philosophy about government. Certainly in American politics today, one party is more likely to espouse that view of government. Write down in your notes which party it is, and we'll talk in class and make sure you picked it up. One example of a proponent of this view is Grover Norquist, who founded a group called Americans for Tax Reform. Grover Norquist said he wanted government to be small enough so that he could drown it in the bathtub, which is a pretty colorful figure of speech. And he managed to get just about every elected Republican in national office to sign a pledge that they would never vote to raise taxes. Because if you starve government's income, then it can't do more, is his theory, to take away liberty. Um, it's worth thinking about how you might push against that idea too. In your notes, think about support and opposition to that theory. What can you say to back up the idea that government takes away liberty? And what could you do to promote the idea that it protects liberty? I'm going to show you another speech with a different idea about how government should work, so you can contrast. Here we go.
The journey will be difficult. The road will be long. I face this challenge with profound humility and knowledge of my own limitations. But I also face it with limitless faith in the capacity of the American people. Because if we are willing to work for it and fight for it and believe in it, then I am absolutely certain that generations from now, we will be able to look back and tell our children that this was the moment when we began to provide care for the sick and good jobs to the jobless. This was the moment when the rise of the oceans began to slow and our planet began to heal. This was the moment when we ended a war and secured our nation and restored our image as the last best hope on earth. This was the moment. This was the time when we came together to remake this great nation so that it may always reflect our very best selves and our highest ideals. Thank you, Minnesota. God bless you. God bless the United States of America.
So Obama's laying out his theory of government, and it's different than Reagan's. Even though each might accept broadly the principle that government should be limited and that it has some function, they're at pretty different places on the spectrum. Obama is an example of a more liberal view that government has a role in providing care for the sick, jobs to the jobless, in helping the environment. All of those things show a view that government should be active. And really, in the years since that speech, we've seen some stronger voices in the Democratic Party about government doing even more, providing even more expansive health care, support for education, childcare from young to old, a government that does more than the US government does now. You might believe the scope of government should grow. You might believe it should shrink, and you might believe somewhere in between that some issues are ones the government should become more involved in and others less. Think about it. Put in your notes where you are on that issue. Are you generally satisfied with the size and scope of government? What's something where you'd be comfortable with government doing more, or you desperately want it to do more? What about where it should do less? And worth thinking in all that, and going back to our theories of how democracy should work, is what's government's role in promoting things like equality? Does government need to step in and prevent the majority from stepping on the minority sometimes? I asked you about parties earlier, and I think you've got a feel for this already, probably. But I want to see if you can connect directly how views on the scope of government relate to your voting patterns. For example, in 2016, if people said, I want government to do more and to grow, who were they more likely to vote for? And if they said, I want government to do less, who were they more likely to vote for? Make your guesses in your notes, and you're about to see the answers. Boom. It's really clear. The 45% of Americans who said government should do more voted overwhelmingly for Hillary Clinton. And the 50% who said government should do less voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. In the years since then, I'm speaking now in 2020, when a pandemic is still sweeping across the country, support for the government doing more in that general way has grown. And that's a trend you see in American history. Over time, when the public is faced with deep challenges, they're more willing for the government to do more. And when someone is in charge who believes government should do more, often there's a backlash from the public who says they want government to do less. We'll think about that general idea, and we'll also look at specific programs that are popular and are less popular with the American people. Think about for yourself anything you'd want to cut, anything you want to grow in terms of specific programs that government carries out. The last thing we'll look at today is political culture. Elements that are uniquely American in some people's eyes. I think you'll find connections to other countries' values too, but there are some ways in which every country has a distinct set of values in which you can tell the difference between talking to an American about how they see their country and talking to a German about how they see their country. Not every single person, but in the aggregate, when you talk to a lot of people about how they view their country. Some of these values might feel inspirational. Others might feel awkward or even dangerous. You might not support each of these values or the way they're carried out in practice, but they're worth examining. Let's look at them. Popular sovereignty, the idea that the people should get to decide things. That's big. And certainly in the United States, people believe that they should have a vote that matters and that individually they should have a great deal of sovereignty over themselves. Respect for the minority. That's a piece of American political culture which might vary depending on who you talk to, but certainly one aspect, one thread that's run through our history. Individualism. More than many countries, we're not a collectivist culture. We don't always look at group good. Instead, a lot of times we talk about individual choice, the ability to act differently than others and to look out for yourself. Assimilation, which might seem contradictory. In addition to individualism, a lot of Americans believe that those who move here should become part of what is sometimes called a melting pot. Some more modern thinkers think America should be more like a salad bowl with distinct elements, different flavors involved, rather than a melting pot where they sort of blend together. But you certainly see assimilation running through the ideas that are popular in American culture. Laissez-faire government, one that stays out of economic matters. More than a lot of wealthy nations, Americans are taxed at pretty low rates and have services that are much less from government than other wealthy nations provide. We're taxing less, we're spending less, we have a government that regulates business less. That is something that is distinctly American as well. Personal liberty certainly is important to Americans. People talk about how it's a free country a lot. That's not unique to our country, but it's certainly a thread running through American political culture. National security, we've beefed up our military such that it's larger than any other military in the world, and in fact, larger than most of the rest of the world's militaries combined. Egalitarianism, equality, is a piece of American values as well, even though it can clash sometimes with the other values. American exceptionalism is something you'll see politicians talk about sometimes, that we're different and even better than other countries. There's a lot of pushback against that. And in fact, polling today shows less support for that idea than sometimes in the past. But certainly that has run through a lot of American history as well, from the age of manifest destiny, really to the modern era. The last one's populism, and I want to look at that some too. Some people asked about it. Populism is an idea that says, let's look out for the little guy, the one who's not in power. And there's elements of populism that could feel uncomfortable as well. That could feel like manipulation or condescension. Someone saying, I'm looking out for the little guy who is themselves a millionaire and is not the little guy. That could be a great public service of theirs, or it could feel like they're putting on an act. Once when Adlai Stevenson was running for president, someone shouted out from the crowd, all thinking Americans support you. And he shouted back, that's not nearly enough. That wasn't a particularly populist point of view that he knew best and that maybe not many Americans did. But looking for elements of populism in American politics isn't always looking for the best of America. Sometimes it's just looking for the language that's used that sounds populist. It might remind you, though, of 4 constitutional amendments that came really quickly between 1913 and 1920. The Progressive Era added 4 amendments that were all in a way looking out for the little guy. We'll go into these in more detail later, but that's what I'll close with today. That the 16th Amendment that allowed Americans to be taxed based on their income opened up a whole new world of ability for government in America to grow in scope. And who was it pushing for the 16th Amendment? Well, in some ways, the little guy. Rural farmers who wanted more assistance from government knew the only way to do it was to tax the rich more rather than tax everyone the same, which had basically been the plan in the past. The 17th Amendment let us vote for U.S. senators, more ability for the little guy to influence what happens in Washington rather than for our state politicians to choose it. The 18th Amendment banned alcohol, and that is a populist amendment in some ways too. A lot of the support for the 18th Amendment came from women who said, we're in a society where we don't have much power, and the men in our lives often abuse us, more so when they're drunk, that in a way, they argued, the 18th Amendment and abolition of alcohol would lead to greater freedom for women who didn't have much power. And finally, the 19th Amendment more directly gave women the right to vote, ratified 100 years before me making this video, back in 1920. It was also a progressive amendment and one that gave power to those who had less. That's where I'll close today. See if you can think of other examples of ways in which America has moved to help the little guy and ways in which you can push against that idea to say we're not all that populist and reality. See you next time.